Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the columnist and parliamentary sketch writer for the Telegraph, Madeline Grant. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Metro accuses the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary of being asleep at the wheel over the UK's role in the changing situation in Afghanistan. The Guardian notes that 11 former cabinet ministers were among those expressing their anger at the Prime Minister's handling of the situation. The Telegraph reports that MPs hold US President Joe Biden in contempt over his decision to withdraw American troops despite the upheaval. And that's the same for the front of the Times. The Express has a slightly different take on the debate, focusing instead on the Prime Minister backing his approach to the withdrawal. The Mirror's verdict is simple: Johnson humiliated. The Star invites Boris Johnson to take a long, hard look at the face of the little boy on their front page, saying, "Shame on you." The Mail turns its attention to Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who it says failed to make a crucial call to his Afghan counterpart about the urgent airlift of translators. Instead, the call was delegated to another Foreign Office minister. And the Financial Times leads with a $16 billion takeover bid in the US involving two of the world's biggest futures trading companies. And we're joined tonight by Kevin Maguire and Madeline Grant. Evening to you both. I mean, the paper's pretty unanimous in their coverage of this story this evening. Let's turn to the Metro first, Kevin. And asleep at the wheel, the headline there, focusing on the stark and scathing criticism of both Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab today.
No, absolutely. From the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who will be delighted at that headline in the Metro, while in Downing Street and the Foreign Office, they will be despair, because the essential charge was the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister let the country in Afghanistan down, were on holidays when Kabul was falling, and that will strike home. And I went there, the Commons, to watch it, and what was very noticeable is few Conservatives attempted to defend the Prime Minister, who waffled, was a bit lacklustre, knew he was in trouble, likes to bask as the new Winston Churchill, who was more Neville Chamberlain over what's happened with Afghanistan. And the media coverage will be lapped up by Labour, and it will have many Conservatives in despair, because I think those allegations that they were asleep at the wheel, that the casualness and incompetence of Johnson on this issue has resulted in measures not being taken that should have been done better to get people out of Afghanistan earlier. It sticks because there is a large element of truth in it.
Yeah, Madeline, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, talking about a dereliction of duty. You cannot coordinate an international response from the beach.
Yes, it was a very good line, and yes, as Kevin says, he'll be delighted that it's on the front page. And I was just really struck by the sheer level of fury amongst backbenchers on all sides, and it wasn't just at the government for failing to prepare or foresee the chaos, although there was clearly a great deal of anger on that front. But there was serious anger laid at the feet of President Biden in America, at NATO. I mean, from all sides of the House. Rarely do you see the chamber being so united on anything. And in all of this, the PM was getting very, very little support from his own backbenchers. And I was struck by the lack of kind of cheering and the hissing and muttering and jeering that was going on when he was delivering his statement. And it just felt very much like, complete consensus in Parliament that is rare.
And I suppose, Madeline, because we haven't seen the Commons as packed as it was today for so long, the isolation of the Prime Minister all the more apparent.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there were some in Tory circles who felt that having a packed chamber once again might be useful to the PM, but actually it was quite the opposite today. You had the very awkward sort of visual setting of it. So, for example, you have next to the Prime Minister, you have the Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, who just looked the absolute picture of misery kind of glaring into the middle distance, occasionally openly huffing and puffing. And you had the physical presence of many ex-servicemen MPs who gave incredible speeches. And there was nowhere to hide. And I do think in the kind of COVID compliant parliament that we've had so far, there's perhaps more opportunity for ministers to get away with not answering questions properly, for MPs of all stripes to kind of indulge in these long pre-rehearsed statements. But now it felt a bit more like an active parliament in which, that those sort of sneaky solutions are no longer possible.
And Kevin, the Daily Mail pointing the finger at Dominic Raab for being too busy on holiday to help Afghan translators. What's their story?
Yeah, that he delegated an important call to the Afghan government to try and get people out, those Afghans who worked and cooperated with Britain to bring them here, because he was on holiday, he didn't make the call. And Dominic Raab is led. He's either been very effective or a charmed life, whichever you want to choose. Of course, he's studying for Boris Johnson when he was in intensive care with COVID as First Secretary of State. He deputises at Prime Minister's questions. But today he looked under a lot of pressure. He was red-faced, shouting at Keir Starmer when he pointed out he'd been on holiday. Others made that point. He was in a 5-star resort on Crete when Kabul was falling. He came back on Sunday. The Prime Minister was heading off to the southwest. I think he got as far as Somerset, and he had to come back. It's just not good. Now, of course, every politician is entitled to a holiday, but if you'd just been watching TV, listening to the radio, reading newspapers, glancing at the internet, anyone could have seen that the Taliban were advancing at a rapid rate across Afghanistan, and yet the Prime Minister and his deputy both went off on holiday. And the Prime Minister's got problems, but I think so has the Foreign Secretary. His judgment, particularly when we're told he was advised not to go, his judgment looks very, very flawed on this.
The Guardian also focusing on that wall of fury, as it describes it, Madeline, from all wings of the Conservative Party. 11 former cabinet ministers criticising the Prime Minister, and it highlights, The Guardian, it highlights the speech by Theresa May, former Prime Minister, and her attack on the intelligence failures.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, her speech was one of the real standouts of the proceedings. I suppose that there was a great deal of rage in the Commons from all sides, as we've talked about. But I think, alongside all of that, it did feel at times that there was a kind of upswell of anger, but perhaps a bit less discussion about what we're going to do next. So the discussion of Raab and his holiday plans, there was a big sort of jeering match between Raab and Ian Blackford, and the Speaker had to intervene. And there was a lot of deserved criticism and finger pointing. But I wonder if alongside that, there could have been a bit more talk of, what on earth are we actually going to do practically to deal with this disaster that we've contributed to?
Let's have a look at the Telegraph now then, Kevin, and not just the PM and the Foreign Secretary under fire. Condemnation of President Biden as well in the Commons today.
No, absolutely. The Telegraph, which had Boris Johnson as a columnist, which Dominic Cummings told us. Boris Johnson is a big fan of the Telegraph, wants to know what it's saying. They go on the criticism of the US President Joe Biden, as does the Times. And Tom Tugendhat, soldier MP on the Conservative side who served in Afghanistan, Dan Jarvis, Labour MP, soldier too, who served in Afghanistan, both in particular went for the president, not least on him saying, well, if the Afghan army wouldn't fight, why wouldn't the US? Why would the US army fight on their behalf? And just pointing out 70,000 people in the Afghan army and police have been killed in this conflict. The Afghan army is known not to be particularly well paid, and in fact, some weren't paid at all. So it was quite interesting listening to Tugendhat and Jarvis, who have first-hand experience speaking that way, and I think it requires a lot of people to reassess. But there's no doubt, as Theresa May said, that and who's turning out to be a better former Prime Minister, I think, than she was Prime Minister, but that it was the Biden plan, the Trump plan implemented by Biden. But Biden is coming in for a lot of flack, and deservedly so, as he tries to wash his hands of this. You can understand why he wanted the US out of Afghanistan, but you have to take some responsibility for the consequences and the Taliban so rapidly taking control, because that's just going to create huge problems in the future, not least for women in Afghanistan, unless they've undergone some radical, complete change, which would be incredibly surprising, really unlikely.
Yeah, and let's have a look at the Star front page, Madeline, now. An image of a little boy and a plea from the Star for Boris Johnson to take a long, hard look at the face of this little boy. Shame on you and that of Joe Biden, it says, Madeline.
Yes, it's a very powerful cover. And I think it really reflects the way in which, however people in Britain might have felt before the withdrawal, however little people had been following the issue of Afghanistan in general, amongst it hadn't featured heavily in the news all that much until recently when the withdrawal seemed imminent. It shows just how quickly these kind of images are really seared into the public consciousness, and that's why they could prove so very damaging for the people who've been in charge. I suspect that some of the images that we've seen, the desperate people clinging to planes, the abuse of children, and there's likely to be, sadly, a lot more of this over the coming days.
Babies being passed over the barbed wire fence to soldiers as well, images that are going to haunt us for a long time.
Yeah, I think they'll be haunting in the same way that, you know, the image of Tank Man on Tiananmen Square has stuck with people forever. You know, a picture paints 1,000 words, and there are so many horrible pictures coming out right now.
Madeline, Kevin, thanks very much indeed. Don't go away, though. We're going to be back in just a couple of minutes to discuss how schools are planning to deal with COVID once the summer holidays are over. We'll see you then. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Kevin Maguire and Madeline Grant. But we have some breaking news to bring you before we take another look at the papers. And US President Joe Biden has said that US forces will stay in Afghanistan until all Americans are evacuated, even if that means staying beyond August the 31st. There had been concern that US forces would pull out within days. The UK ambassador to Afghanistan saying today that they were working on the basis of needing to get people out within days rather than weeks. Let's bring in our guests this evening, Kevin Maguire and Madeline Grant, to take a look at the papers. We're going to turn to the Telegraph, and it has a story about school plans for COVID when schools return. Interesting, we heard from Joe Biden in America earlier, Kevin, who gave a statement in the White House about coronavirus, not about Afghanistan, didn't take any questions, but he did talk about mask wearing in schools and how imperative it was for the under-12s who aren't vaccinated to continue to wear masks. Not the plan here. What is the UK planning when schools return?
No, there's still a huge problem across the United States because of low vaccination levels in many states. But here the plan, the Telegraph says schools have been advised that if 5 or more pupils test positive, instead of sending everybody home, one of the options is to have classes outside. Now, of course, the whole pandemic should be over, because it's now, if you're double vaxxed, then you just have to test daily if you've been in contact with somebody. Most kids aren't going to be actually jabbed by the time schools come back. So the government is looking at other ways in England of dealing with this. Lessons outside sounds quite good. Well, it depends where your school is. If you're next to a busy road or on a very built-up site, it's not going to be too good.
Depends on the weather as well, doesn't it?
Exactly, but at least, right, trying to be as upbeat and as positive as I can. At least the government appears to be looking for solutions now, of ways of making it work and stop disrupting the education of kids.
Madeline, we are running out of time, but just one other story also on the front of the Telegraph. Geronimo the alpaca.
Oh, yes. He's going to die, according to the High Court. And this we can expect the alpaca culture war to rumble on for some time. I mean, I'm sort of amazed by the attention that this story has got in the general public. I think it perhaps shows either that we're a very caring country about the welfare of animals, or that perhaps we've all gone a bit potty over the summer break. I think it's perhaps one of the two.
OK, we are out of time.